Live from On the Horn Studios, this is Mike Kaiser, and you are listening to a special edition of Business Mind. Today in the studio, we are really excited to have Yaron Lew, and actually, we have a whole studio full of people today. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Yaron is the founder of Business Technology Management. They do a lot of proprietary business improvement methodology. Work with a lot of companies in turnaround, improving business performance. He's got a huge background in this, leading business improvement programs and company turnarounds, as we mentioned, has developed advanced management tools. And today, Yaron is coming in to talk to us in the studio and everybody else out there about essentially bringing lean manufacturing or lean principles to the small business. So I welcome Yaron and welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. So yes, my name is Yaron Lew, and what I will try and do today is, as Mike mentioned, try to talk to you guys about some of the principles of business improvement as they apply to the small business and all the way up to the larger business. But I want to start by saying that when I talk to business owners, a lot of times I ask them, what is your definition of doing better? Because I always assume that we're here because we want to do better. And I get various answers to that, from increasing sales to increasing profits, reducing our costs, reducing our response times to the customers, reducing stress. Sure. Or some even say that they want to retire early. I even met one person that said, no, none of these apply to me. What I really want to do is be recognized nationally and internationally. So every one of us has his own definition of how do we see doing better. What I am here to try and do is help in crystallizing some of the ways to get there. And obviously, I will take any questions that you guys have. And I want to start by talking about the phases of business management. And I'm very happy to have a large mix of businesses in the audience today, because the first phase is what I call the intuitive phase. And the intuitive phase is when the business is very small and you're able, as the entrepreneur or as the founder of the business, to manage the business by what I call by your gut, which is basically you have the feel of the market, you have the feel of your business, and you can, by using your intuition, manage your business. But as soon as the business grows, you get into what I call the quantitative phase. And the quantitative phase is when the business has grown probably above 10 employees. Some would say 15 or 20. But at that point, you cannot rely on your intuition to manage the business anymore. And you need to put in place procedures. You need to put in place measurements that will help you do two things. One, make sure that the product or service that you provide to your customers is within what you would consider to be the quality that you would like to provide to your customers. And second, to get feedback on how the business is doing, because you no longer can manage it by intuition and get the feel in your gut of how the business is doing, because it's much bigger than what you started. And then, of course, the scientific or engineered phase will be that phase in which the business has grown a lot more, and you start to look at the flow of the process between business units or within business units, and you have to start considering the randomness of events. And I will get into that throughout the presentation. So through this presentation, I will take you through what are the things that I think are important to look at when you're at the intuitive phase. What are the things that I think you should look at when you graduated to the quantitative phase? And of course, when you get to the scientific or engineered phase, how would we go about that? I want to start by defining direct and indirect service, okay? And I will talk throughout this presentation both about the service industry and the manufacturing industry almost in interchangeable terms, because as I mentioned before, what's important is that there is a process, okay? And if there is a process, it doesn't matter if it's a service process or a manufacturing process. Sometimes people look at manufacturing processes only because it's easier to see, because you have physical entities that move from one step to the other. But whether you do software development or whether you do engineering or whether you do insurance policies, there is a process in there as well. And the direct service, I think the best way to look at it is think about a hairdresser or your barber, for example. Okay, that is a direct service business because the business is performed directly on the customer. Okay, not only is it performed directly on the customer, but it's easy for the service provider to get the feel of the customer. Okay, and inject the customer's DNA into the service. And I will talk about that in a little while. And there is a term that I would like to introduce here, and that is the service ratio. Okay, and the service ratio is the difference between the time that service is actually being performed on the customer to the overall time from, let's look at the barber, from when you walked in the door to when you walked out. Okay, in the direct service business, what you find is that the service ratio is very high. Again, think about your barber. You walk in, you wait a little bit, hopefully, you get service, you walk out. Probably in the range of 70% of the time, 80% of the time, service is performed on the customer directly, and there is a lot of interaction between you, the service provider, and your customers, so you're able to gauge what his needs are, gauge what his specifications are, gauge what I call customer DNA is, and you can inject that into the service that you provide to your customer. In the indirect service, the service is not performed on the customer. Okay? The customer will give you an order for a widget, and you will produce it for them. The customer will send his lawnmower to get serviced before the summer starts, okay? The service is being performed while the customer isn't there. When the customer isn't there, there is limited interaction between the service provider and the customer, and therefore it's much harder for the service provider to gauge the customer DNA and inject that into the service. The service ratio is very, very small. When you think about any indirect service, and most services are indirect services, the interaction between the service provider and the customer is in the range of 5%, 10%. And there, it is much harder for you as a service provider to understand what are the unique aspects of the customer that you are providing the service to. And therefore, if you're at the intuitive phase, okay, some of the things that you have to think about when you provide the service is, let's start with the fact that craftsmanship is the basis for everything. If you don't provide the product at the highest quality and you are the best at what you do, it'll be very hard to convince customers to come to your shop or to give you their order. Now, the interaction with the customer, and when I talk about the interaction with the customer, I talk about the interaction with the customer on the broad sense of the term and not in the narrow sense, and I will expand on that. That is where a lot of businesses fail. And what happens is you need to service the customer throughout the cycle, even though the customer isn't there. And it's very hard for the service provider that is in the indirect business to think about it in those terms. But what I see many times is that when you don't take the time to understand your customer's DNA, to understand his unique aspects and unique specifications, and you are concentrating on providing your service and providing the best product that you know how to produce, because as I said, craftsmanship is number one. What happened is You don't look at your service from the customer standpoint. You look at the service from the service provider standpoint. And I find in many areas when I go to a business that is in the intuitive phase, what happens is when I ask the service provider or the business owner, how well do you think you're doing? And he says, I am providing the best product to my customer. When I ask the customers, how do you think he's doing? What I get many times is, geez, when I finally got the product, it was a good product. But boy, it either wasn't on time or it wasn't exactly the way that I wanted it. Even though the product, when I got it, was very good, it wasn't exactly the color that I wanted. It wasn't exactly the type that I selected, or it wasn't on time. So from the service provider standpoint, you say, I did a great job. From the customer standpoint, all of a sudden you say, he didn't do such a great job. And there is a dichotomy that I see many times between the service provider and the customer, that they look at the same product and they gauge themselves differently. And what I tell people is, when you're in the intuitive phase, one of the things that you have to think about is look at your business, look at your product through the eyes of the customer and not through the eyes of the service provider. As a service provider, when I ask you, how do you think you're doing? Immediately your pride kicks in and you say, I'm doing great. However, because it's an indirect service and because there is very little interaction between you and the customer, what you find many times is that even though you think you did great, the customer will say, not really. So what I tell people in the intuitive phase, one of the things I tell them is, look at other businesses. Don't look at your business. Look at other businesses and ask yourself, how would I have done that better? What would I have changed in somebody else's business? How would I change the way that he is doing business as though I was his customer? And only then turn around and look at your own business. But I find it's a lot easier for the service provider to disassociate himself from his own business and from his own process and look at somebody else's business and then look at how he would have done that differently, and then come back home and say, okay, with those set of eyes, let me look at my own business and how would I have done it differently. I always tell business owners that are in the intuitive phase, think about your service ratio. What is your service ratio? How big is it? Are you like the barber at the 80%? Or are you like the guy that waxes my skis before the ski season at the 2%? Because I bring him the skis, he gives it back to me. Guess what? If he didn't take the time to look at my DNA and understand how I would like my skis waxed, he would look at it as every other order and give me my skis back where he thinks he did a great job, but either the edges are too sharp or the skis are too waxed, or something will be there where he believes he did a great job and I don't look at it that way. And even if you're in the direct service business, I always like to give the example of Joe, my barber, who the first time I walked in the door, I sat on the chair and I said, Joe, I would like to get my hair done like this and I would like my hair done like that. And Joe looks at me and says, no. You don't tell me how to do my job. I know exactly how to do my job and I will cut your hair exactly the way that I think it should be cut. So here's an example of direct service and the service provider that believes that he does a great job and you as the customer says, nah, I don't really think so. So the last two things that I want to mention in the intuitive phase is understanding your customer's expected response time. And what I mean by that is, and probably the easiest example of that would be when you walk into a restaurant, how soon do you expect to be seated? How soon do you expect to be served? And whether or not you will go back to the same restaurant if their service response time exceeded your expectation. To the bad side, not to the not to the good side. Exceeded, not they served you faster, but they served you slower, or took a lot longer than you wanted to be seated. Many service providers don't, especially in this phase, don't look at what is the customer's expected response time. And even though you think you give them a great product, what you find later is that it took, in their mind, not in your mind, in their mind, a lot longer to get to the end than what they expected. So one of the things that you have to ask yourself is not only what is my service ratio and how I improve it, but also what is my customer's expected response time. And if I don't know what it is, how do I get that information? And the last aspect is something that people don't measure. And I always ask people to at least take a look at it. And that's what I call the buy customers, B-Y, B-U-Y, versus the buy, which is B-Y-E. The buy customers, the B-Y-E customers, are the customers that walk into the shop or walk into the store, walked around, either weren't serviced or didn't find what they were looking for, turned around and walked away. Those are not measured. You don't know how many of those you have. And what you find is that because your service ratio is very low, you did not provide that customer with the attention that he was looking for when he walked in the door. And a lot of times, a customer that walked in with an intention to buy, I walked into one of the large department stores wanting to buy a large screen TV. And I was walking around for about 15 minutes looking for somebody to service me. I knew pretty much what I wanted. And all I wanted is for somebody to help me choose the right TV. And there was nobody there. And I was walking around, and eventually I got tired of it and I walked out the door. They didn't measure the, whatever it was, $1,200 or $1,500 that they lost that day because nobody was there to service me. From a buy customer, I turned into a buy customer and I went away. What I find is that most businesses do not measure that and don't measure themselves and give themselves a report of how well I do with my buy customers versus the buy, which are the ones that went away. So with that in mind, some of the things that I think businesses, even if they are small and at the intuitive phase, need to do is develop some information format where they can capture the customer DNA. Why? Because what happens is when the customer will come back, you already went with them through that cycle, and you now know some of the things that are important to them and some of their unique aspects. For example, there will be one that the due date is very important to them. And there will be one that the due date is less important, but the exact color of the carpet that you install will be a lot more important than whether you did it in 2 days or you did it in 3 days. There will be those that will give the lawnmower for service before the summer, and they don't like the blades to be sharp. They actually think that a rounded blade does a better job than a sharp blade. If you're able to capture that information, then the next time the customer comes, you don't have to pull it out of your head. You have some sort of a database that you can relate to. And in every business, how do you develop that information database for your customer's DNA is different because every business is different. But when you start to think in those terms and you start to inject the customer's DNA into your service cycle, you all of a sudden start to break some of the boundaries and you start to provide better service to the extent that the customer will turn around and tell his friends, look, this guy, not only is he doing a great job, but he also understood the aspects that were important to me, and I think you should go and have him service you. The next thing that I would say is that after you make an implementation plan on how am I going to do this, you have to ask yourself, okay, what are the priorities? What are the customers that I will start to store in my DNA data bank? How will I go about it? Will I go on all of them, or will I go with the ones that give me the most business? Do that, choose the first three, and then go down the line, okay? If you try to attack all of your customers at once, it'll probably be too much to swallow. So after you make an implementation plan on how you're going to do this, you have to decide on the priorities in which you're going to implement it. And then, of course, the two last things that I think every business should look at, regardless of what phase they're in. One is, how do you increase the service ratio? And when I say that, what I mean is, for example, I will give you guys an example. My wife always complains about her cleaning lady. And the cleaning lady basically comes into our house when we're not there. She cleans the house, she leaves the house, and hopefully it's locked after she left. My wife always complained that the cleaning lady is not doing this right and she's not doing that right. And one day I told her, why don't you invite her to come in when you're actually at home? And you can actually interact with her while she's doing the service. So some people will say it's a watchdog. Other people will say, no, you increase the service ratio, because when the cleaning lady came and my wife was home, they actually interacted on a minute-by-minute basis. And my wife was able to direct her and tell her what are the things that she thinks she's not doing right and how she thinks she can improve it. Now, the one fallacy with that view is obviously that I don't think the onus should be on the customer to increase the service cycle. Okay, the onus should be on the service provider to understand why is it important to increase the service cycle and take the steps themselves to increase the service cycle. Because the electrician, the plumber, the painter, every one of those is an indirect service. If I have to stay home to tell them what to do, guess what? I will go somewhere else. And I will not recommend them to somebody else. So the onus is always on the service provider, not on the customer, to increase the service cycle. And that's very important to remember. And the last is to try and gauge your buy versus buy customers. The customers that walked away and didn't buy your product versus the ones that actually got that which they were looking for and actually turned their walking into your shop or walking in or calling you on the phone to a buy. I want to move now to the quantitative phase, okay? And in the quantitative phase, as I said, you have to start looking at putting together procedures and measurements in order to move from the very small business to the larger business that cannot anymore control by your intuition. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the direct correlation between orders or inventory, throughput, and lead time or cycle time. Think about it as a flow tube. Think about it as an hourglass. Any of those, what happens is the rate at which your product flows out is your throughput. The amount of orders or the amount of inventory that you have in your system, the amount of customers waiting for their insurance policy, the amount of customers waiting for their signs, the amount of customers that are waiting for their carpets to be installed, the amount of customers that you have in the system that you have not delivered yet constitutes your inventory, okay? Your ability to flow the product out versus the amount of inventory that you have in the system dictates your lead time. How long will it take you to get from beginning to end, from the order that just walked in the door to that order being delivered? And many times, what happens is that as you become better and more recognized, you get more customers. Guess what? You get more orders. You get more orders. Guess what? If your throughput rate, your ability to service customers remains the same, what happens to your lead time? It starts to creep up. You start to all of a sudden tell your customer that called, I cannot deliver it next week. I can deliver it in 2 weeks. And then it becomes 3 weeks, okay? And there is a limit, okay, to what customers will be willing to take because you're the best, right? I said from the outset, if you're not the best, it's a different story. But if you are the best and people want your services, there is a limit to how much they're willing to accept it will take to deliver the product to them. Okay? And what I see is that as businesses become better, more recognized, gain more customers, their lead time starts to grow, and then customers leave. Customers leave, guess what happens? Their lead time starts to shrink back because they have less customers. They have less customers, and our response time is very fast, and customers starts to come back. So I see these self-inflicted cycles in businesses where because you're very good, all of a sudden your service starts to suffer. Because your service suffered, now customers left and you can be very good again. And this is a business pendulum that I see in many businesses, whether they are small businesses or large businesses. Okay, people don't recognize the correlation between orders or inventory, the ability to service or throughput, and the lead time. And then I tell people, okay, what you need to do is you need to ask yourself as a business owner, what is my bottleneck? And I am telling you right now that as I walk through many, many businesses, nationally and internationally, and I ask that question, the one thing that I almost never find is that prototypical large machine that is at its capacity and is the bottleneck of the process. What I find is that bottlenecks in businesses move from place to place. But as the business owner, you have to ask yourself, what is my bottleneck? What limits or dictates my ability to service my customers? Okay, and it can be either tangible, a machine, a person, a service, or it can be intangible. It can be intangible, for example, the product mix as it comes to you through the market, okay, may cause one of your services, one of your operations to all of a sudden become a bottleneck only because you got a certain type of order that puts a demand on a certain process where if you next week will get a different type of order, it will put the emphasis and the load somewhere else. So bottlenecks can move from place to place. But you as the business owner must ask yourself, what is my bottleneck? And what I find is that the answer is not intuitive. And just by asking yourself that question, okay, not going through any fancy analysis, just asking yourself that question as a business owner, what is my bottleneck? Opens up a lot of possibilities to say, okay, if I know what my bottleneck is, and I will address that bottleneck, and we will talk about how to address that in a minute, I can now do what? Increase the amount of services that I can provide to customers, or increase the number of products that I can flow through my system. And then what? Shrink my lead time back, right? And then I can be more responsive to the customers and provide more services or more products. And yeah, by the way, make more money because it's from your existing resources. You didn't have to go and invest in additional resources. The other things that I tell people that have gotten to the quantitative phase is I tell them, draw your service cycle. Rudimentary drawing. I'm not looking for flow charts. I'm not looking for any intensive, if people heard as is or to be or any of those. No. I'm telling you, take a piece of paper, take a pen, and draw what your service cycle looks like. Just by drawing what your service cycle looks like, it'll all of a sudden draw your attention to say, if this is what my service cycle looks like, one of the things that, for example, will come up is the question of where does my service cycle begin? Where does it begin? And I walk into a business and I ask, where does your process begin? And many people don't have a very good answer to where do their process begin. Does it begin with the customer calling you? Or does it begin with you going to the market and soliciting the customers to call you? Does it start with getting an order if you're a manufacturing business? Or does it start when you have a product that you flow to the system if you're in the manufacturing operations? So many times, not only is the beginning of the service cycle not necessarily true or sure, what I also find is that a lot of people don't know what are the conditions that will start the process with zero disruptions. And I will refer to that term a little bit later. But a zero disruption basically means I have all the information needed in order to start the process so that there are no unknowns when I go to produce my service or to produce my product. The other thing that I tell people is to chart their performance long term. Okay? Look at the last 3 years of your sales. Look at your last 3 years of products delivered. Look at the last 3 years of customers serviced. Okay? And look at whether you are in stagnation, in growth, or in decline. Okay? And that'll tell you where you're headed. But then what I tell people is now look at a much shorter increment of time. So, for example, if it takes you a week to provide your service, look at your business on a daily basis. Look at the last month on a daily basis, okay? And look at what you delivered. And if you can, and a lot of people don't have that, what was the demand from the market, okay? And I will get back to the difference between delivered and demand in a minute, okay? But the small increments of time and how you perform in a small increments of time will tell you what is the variability of your demand, okay? And I will go for a minute to Joe the barber, okay? And guess what? If you walk into Joe's shop at noontime, you will find 5 people there. And you'll do the math in your head and say, geez, if it takes Joe 15 minutes to do a customer, I'm going to be sitting here for what, an hour and 15 minutes before I get serviced? I'm not sure I want that, okay? Joe might have serviced 30 customers that day, but it wasn't his true demand because I went from a buy customer to a buy customer, right? I walked into the shop, looked at the line and said, no, that's too long, and walked away. So the true market demand is not reflected in the number of customers that you actually serviced. Those customers that called you and asked for your service and you gave them a due date in 3 weeks or a month and said, no, that's too long, are not counted in the customers that you serviced. Where do they count? They count in my terminology as lost opportunities, and we will talk about them in a minute. So lost opportunity are all of those customers that heard about you, came to you, and for some reason, and the reasons are vary, but not because you cannot provide the service. Because if you cannot provide the service, it's one thing. But if you can provide the service and the customer walked into the shop or gave you a call and you could not deliver it in the time frame that he wanted, just like I walked into Joe's and said, I'm not willing to wait an hour and 15 minutes, I am a lost opportunity, okay? And the difference between the actual delivered and the market demand sometimes is a lot of money that you leave on the table, okay? And we will talk about addressing lost opportunities in a minute. Now, the other things that it will tell you when you look at small increments of time is how quickly, what is the frequency and variations, how big they are. Because if you have small variations, it's one thing. If you have large variations, you have to start thinking about what? What is your capacity in relation to market demand? And we will talk about that in a minute. Because one of the things that I tell people in the quantitative phase when they're looking for measurements to give them feedback on how well their business is doing is I tell them, one, you have to start measuring your service ratio. You can no longer just by intuition tell me, I think my service ratio is 10%. I think that at the quantitative phase, you have to start measuring your service ratio and giving yourself feedback on how do I reduce it and how well I'm doing in my efforts to reduce it. The second thing is measuring the response time. In other words, as I said, there is a customer expected response time. A lot of people don't measure what the response time to the customer is. And a lot of people lose business because they don't measure the response time. The second thing, or the third thing, I'm sorry, is find a way to quantify your lost opportunities. Because lost opportunities are a lot of money that a lot of businesses lose because they don't go after them. Now, the amount of lost opportunities that you have will tell you how much money you're losing and therefore will drive you to make changes that will enable you to try and capture those lost opportunities. And we will talk about how to expand your capacity in a minute. And the other things that I wanted to talk about is really finding ways, asking yourself, how do I increase my service ratio? Okay, for example, if the customer sends you their product to be serviced and you give it back to them 2 weeks later, and all of your interaction with the customer was when you received it and when you delivered it, the customer is in the dark 90% of the time, 95% of the time. What you have to do is find ways to interact with a customer when he is not talking to you on the telephone or at your shop. How do you give him updates, or how do you make sure that the progress that you make is in accordance to what the customer is expecting and gives the customer the ability to, as I said, inject his DNA into your service and give you feedback on what you're doing to make sure that what you're doing will eventually come to the conclusion that both you see yourself as delivering a high quality product and the customer says, yes, I received the high quality product that I was looking for. I want to go into some sort of a flow chart that will give people at the quantitative stage a little bit of something to think about, and that is, ask yourself, is my demand at the limit of my capacity? In other words, do I have a lot of lost opportunities? Do I have a lot of those that I could have serviced and I'm not servicing because I don't have the capacity? If your answer to yourself is yes, then the two things that you must put your mind to and try to improve are the ways to flex your capacity. Okay? And I put that first because lost opportunities mean I was here and I'm now not servicing the number of customers that would like to get my service. So how do I flex my capacity so that I can capture those lost opportunities? And I need to develop a way to capture them. It's not enough to know that they're out there, is what do I do in order to capture them? Now, if on the other hand, you're not at the limit of capacity, then you ask yourself, is my service ratio at 100%? And if your service ratio is not at 100%, guess what? Then it means that you need to look at your lost opportunities. But if it is at 100%, then you need to see how do you reduce your service time and how do you reduce your response time to the market. Because if your demand is not at the limit of your capacity and you're not at 100% service ratio, guess what? What you need to work on is getting more customers through the door. To get more customers through the door, your leverage is either your service response time or your cycle time. Okay? This will get you more customers in the door. Now I want to move to the more scientific or engineered phase. And in this phase, what we really do is look at the random events and the way that things flow through the system in a disrupted manner and ask ourselves, how do we straighten the flow? How do we make things flow better? And we do that by first looking at the overall process. And when I say the overall process, I mean you don't look at the individual resources in the process, but you look first at the input and the output. You look at the big picture and you ask yourself, how do my blocks, big building blocks, interact? If I'm able to put in the order with zero disruptions so that it can flow without that initial disruption into the system, can I flow it through the system without disruptions? When I pass the baton from one step to the next, do I pass it with disruptions or without disruptions? What do I need to do in order to make sure that the baton is passed from one step to the next with zero disruptions? And then I look at the individual resource level, and I will give an example from manufacturing, because when I say resource, not everybody understands that I'm not talking specifically about a machine. And by the way, this applies to production or non-production processes, services, hospitals, any place where there is a process and there is a passing of the baton from one step to the next. The resource is not just the machine. The resource is all the necessary conditions that will make the machine turn input into an output. And that includes the tools, and that includes the CNC program, and that includes a computer and electricity and cooling fluids and everything else that will enable you to take the input and turn it into an output. And what happens is those conditions are called dependencies, because your machine, your resource, depends on those in order to turn input into an output. And every one of those dependencies can suffer from a disruption. The power can be disrupted, the tool can break, the program cannot work, and so forth and so on. And what happens is, whether it's in an office environment or whether it is in a manufacturing environment, each of those resources will be disrupted randomly, and we don't know when and for how long, hence the random dynamics of the system. And really what happens is, because every resource can be disrupted, when we pass through the process, we have resources that have their own individual disruptions. We start with a small disruption in the beginning of the process, and unfortunately, when it goes to the first resource that has its own disruptions, they don't cancel each other. A lot of work was done to try and make them cancel each other. It never happens in nature. They always get amplified, and that's, again, going back to the butterfly effect. And when they go through the next resource, which has its own individual disruptions, that gets magnified even further. So people sometimes ask me, will it go on forever? Will it intensify forever? The answer is no. It stops at a certain band. The problem is that when you look at businesses, that band translates to either a lead time that is a lot longer to get something out than what it actually takes to produce things, and the amount that comes out, your throughput rate, is a lot lower than the inherent capabilities within your resources. So when we understand the disruptions that each resource is exposed to, and we measure these disruptions and we quantify them, then and only then do we look at process improvement events. And process improvement events in general fall into two categories. They can be either Kaizen type events that usually focus on the reduction of waste in the process, or they can be Six Sigma type events, which mostly focus on the quality of the product that you deliver. And again, product, service, synonymous. Tracking the disruptions in your process help you decide where to focus. And the techniques, whether it's a Kaizen or 5S or whether it's a Six Sigma, depends on what the actual problem is that you found. And based on questions, we can expand on that a little bit. And then what you have to put in place is a system that will handle the randomness of the events. And what you do is you start by regulating the flow into the system. You institute strategic buffers in critical areas that will able to decouple the external disruptions that you have, for example, vendors' lateness or product mix and so forth and so on, from the internal processes, so that you don't transfer those disruptions that come in into your process. You then have to find ways to be able to flex your capacity so that you are able to process through your process what you flowed into it. You have to institute feedback measurement loops to tell you how you're doing as close to real time as possible. And you have to use the inherent capability of flexing capacity to be able to vacuum the flow of product, whether it is a service, whether it is a tangible product. You have to be able to use your flexing capacity in order to pull it out as a vacuum and shorten that lead time that we talked about. And the last thing that I want to touch on is the phases of improvement. And what I'm going to tell you right now is that when you start to implement some of the things that we talked about, there will be some sort of a paradigm shift, which will enable you to improve your business. And then there will be a certain stabilization period. Once you have gone through stabilization, which basically you're putting in place those procedures, those processes, those ideas that you had in order to tackle your problems, you must think about the next step, which will be a lot harder than the first, because in the first step you gathered a lot of the low-hanging fruits. The next step will be a lot harder. But if you don't start to push your system to the next level, you will experience a stagnation, and then you will be a fall, not to the same level that you started, but you will fall to a much lower level than what you accomplished with all the stuff that we talked about. So you should never be satisfied with the improvements that you made. You make improvements, you get a breakthrough, you stabilize it, and then you start thinking about the next. And I'm telling you, the next one will be a lot harder than the first. I will open it up now for questions. I tried to give you an overview, and based on the questions, I will try to expand on different aspects of what I talked about.
Sure, yes, Yaron. The first question comes from Mike Lauretano Signs. He asked if you can give an example of flex plan for capacity versus demand.
Sure. One of the ideas, for example, that I use many times, a lot of processes are either resource or person dependent. And a lot of times, what was ingrained in us is to look at employees' efficiency and make sure that the employees are always very, very busy. And it was ingrained in us because we live in a cost-oriented society, hence cost accounting, that if the workers are very busy, then they're very efficient and the process is very efficient. Unfortunately, what we find many times is that when the employee is very busy. He does not get all the necessary conditions in order to do his job in the most efficient manner. And what I will tell you is separate the meat, the core of what it is that you hired him to do, and offload from him a lot of the things that he's doing that he wasn't hired to do. And what I find is that many times your employees will do a lot of other things other than their core competencies. And sometimes it will be interacting with customers, which you don't want them to do. And sometimes it will be going to find an available fax machine. And sometimes it will be doing steps of the process that can be delegated to other people that have lower level of competence and can free that employee to do that which he is very good at doing. So an offload will be one idea. The other idea will be teaming. Sometimes what I find out is that if you take two people and make them work together, the product is more than doubled. And two people helping each other, especially if there is a dependency, you try to break the dependency so that the teaming of two people together, as opposed to having one person do the entire process from beginning to end, will help you flex the capacity. And there's a lot of other examples we can go into, but let's go to the next question.
Sure. Next question comes from Franco Cianfaglione. Wants you to discuss customer memory, if you would. He says he finds that most customers forget why they made the decision they did on product choice or how a product works. And he said they're the most dissatisfied, they being the ones with short memory. How should we overcome this?
Well, what I tell people is, and that goes back to the beginning of what I talked before, you have to find a way to inject your customer's DNA into your process. You have to find a way to find out what's important for that customer. And when I say what's important, some customers would like to get a phone call. Some customers would like to get an email. Some customers don't care about the communication as long as you deliver it on time. The problem that we have is that difference between us as service providers believing that we're doing a great job and our customer that says, wait a minute, it's not exactly what I'm looking for. I will give you an example. A friend of mine had a sofa that he didn't want to throw away and he wanted to reupholster it. And there was a long process at which they selected the material, they selected the wood finish and everything else, and he sent it out to this guy that was supposed to be the best at reupholstering sofas. What happened next was a long period of silence. And when his wife finally said, what's going on? I would like to get my sofa for my open house, and I wanted people to see how beautiful it is. She called the guy, and the guy said, well, there was a problem with the fabric, and we didn't get it on time, and we had a little flood because there was a lot of snow this winter and many other things, and it'll be there in 2 weeks. And she said, well, first of all, my open house is in 1 week. So for her, the on time was a lot more important than everything else, which he didn't take into account. But worse than that, when she finally got it late, what happened was he made some decisions that were excellent decisions from a craftsmanship standpoint. For example, firmer pillows because they will last a lot longer. But she said, but I sit on it and it's not comfortable. And he said, but it's the best product because it will last you the longer. Or the material, believe it or not, had a greenish tint in the shop when she selected it. And when he delivered it, it was brown. And she said, how come it's brown? And he said, well, let's take it into the shop and take the sample of material into the shop and take a look at it. And what happens is the lighting in the shop had a greenish tint to it. So what she saw when it was delivered home was something totally different than what she ordered. So injecting your customer's DNA and building that DNA database into your system and finding a way to access it quickly when the customer calls will handle a lot of those problems, I believe.
Our next question comes from Jason Sage from Jagus. Said there's a lot of business process engineering and process re-engineering that's been presented. He's just wondering, are you offering BPM consulting alone or a combined service and software solution? And his second piece is, at what phase in the business do you recommend people call you?
Well, first of all, I didn't come here to offer BTM. I came here to share some ideas with you guys. But if you ask me, when would you call me? People call me for a variety of reasons. The five major reasons that people call me are they either have a tremendous amount of orders that exceeds their capacity, and they want to know how can we deliver more from our existing resources because we don't want to invest capital in our business, okay? Which I believe is a problem that everybody in this economy would love to have, okay? The second problem is we exceed our customers' expected response time. In other words, the customer wants it in 2 weeks and we deliver it in 3 or 4 weeks. How can we shrink our lead time to the market, okay? Which again goes back to what we talked about, the relationship between the amount of inventory, your ability to deliver, which again goes to resource utilization, and the lead time. The next one is our on-time performance is not very good. In other words, we believe that it will take us 3 weeks, but sometimes we deliver in 2.5 weeks, and sometimes we deliver in 5 weeks. So our problem is our on-time performance. We don't deliver what we promised when we promised, okay? The next one will be we deliver everything on time, and we deliver everything within our customers' expected response time, but we don't make any money, okay? Because people go out of their way to do everything the customer wants, and in the end, they don't make any money. And the third, of course, will be, geez, we have a great product. We would like to grab more marketplace. How do we do that? So people come to me with various reasons in mind. They can be operational problems. They can be financial problems. They can be external problems that the market has changed and our product mix has changed. And how do we structure our business to be able to handle this new shift in the marketplace? So that is an answer to when would they come to me. What do I offer? I offer mostly thoughtware, not software. In other words, I put in place a way for you to look at your business differently and to be able to manage your business looking at the flow and putting together measurements and tools and procedures that will enable you to have a robust system that will be able to handle the random dynamics of the business world. I work with whatever software the business has. I sometimes define the engines because a lot of people have systems that will not give them information but give them data. So what I do, because a lot of the systems don't handle flow, they either handle an individual line item or they handle discrete pieces of data, but they don't look at the flow beginning to end as a stream of all the orders, not an individual order. And therefore, I will define the engines that will help them revise their software or install the engines in their software that will be able to help them manage their flow end to end and will give them pointers when things start to not flow correctly.
All right. Well, thank you very much. You've been listening to this special edition of Business Mind. Yaron Lew from Business Technology Management. Thank you so very much for the information that you provided us today.
You're welcome.
Been very informative. Thanks, Brian Parker, for producing. This was brought to you by the eCircle, and especially thanks everybody that was in the studio and listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.